Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Or rather to my many channels, since I'm not only on YouTube. And this is S.C. Coleman, author. Today in this video, we're going to be talking about a singular aspect of the enemy occupation. So, with every conventional military structure, there are three primary components. One, the first, you can look at as the intelligence or the planning apparatus, essentially the brain or the head of the organizational structure. The second element is logistics and supply, the element that provides resources necessary to function. This could also have to do with finance. And the third is direct engagement. In most conventional militaries, this is your force mechanism component, including cavalry, artillery, and infantry, among others. In essence, any direct engagement asset, including airplanes, ships, tanks, whatever, is not a support element. Logistics and supply is a support element, and the intelligence and planning apparatus causes direction. In the context of this video, we are mainly going to be focusing on the planning and intelligence apparatus of the enemy occupation. Summarized into one category, the intelligence and planning apparatus of the enemy occupation is academia. It is the school system, mainly centrally focused around universities. The first document that we're going to look at here is from the ERIC database. In my last video, I talked about that. The ERIC database is a separate classification secure filing network, an intelligence component, which is completely and utterly separate from every governmental, military, or private institution. It is a specific database designed to pass sensitive, classified information among the various elements of the academic, intelligence, and planning component of the enemy conventional forces. This document is listed hskjd or hskjd. Although it's listed as a name, first initial, middle initial, last name, that is also apparently the name of a publishing house. HJ, Hotel Juliet, HSIA. Capital H, lowercase s, lowercase I, lowercase a. Like a last name. The abstract for this paper, Supranational and Supercultural Communication Research, a plea for a worldwide supranational communication center, Texas Tech University, Lubbock, Department of Mass Communication, August 1973. Because of the importance and the internationality of mass communications, it has become necessary to study this phenomenon on a global scale. An organization for supranational communication research located on each of the continents could act as a clearinghouse and person for worldwide communication study. That is, in order to guide the emergence of a world culture, it is essential to ascertain the effects, processes, patterns, and dysfunctions of mass communication in all possible supranational and supercultural settings and on a global scale. It is therefore imperative to establish a supranational communication study centers. Such coordinated work could investigate primary problems, act as a nerve center for studies in other locations, and design principal programs in theory, general systems research, model and systems building, and applied research, in parentheses, CH. Presented to the Association for Education and Journalism Convention, Fort Collins, 1973. Again, it's Supranational and Supercultural Communication Research, a plea for a worldwide supranational communication center, hskjd, Department of Mass Communications, Institute for Mass Communications Research. Permission to reproduce this copyrighted material has been granted by hskjd to ERIC and organizations operating under agreements with the National Institute of Education. Further reproduction outside the ERIC system requires permission of the copyrighted owner. And there you get your classification for secrecy and security reasons. What they are doing here, what we will read in this letter, will be very explanatory of why they want this document specifically under tight control. Communication, as much as a science, observes no national boundaries nor barriers of culture, race, color, or creed. Mass communications as a vital catalyst shapes the development of every nation and also the future of the world. When imaginatively planned and effectively used, mass communication is capable of promoting understanding among nations and races and vastly enhancing the possibility of a world culture emerging from the current communication revolution. In order to guide the emergence of world culture, it is essential to ascertain the effects, processes, patterns, as well as possible dysfunctions of mass communication in all possible supranational and supercultural settings on a global scale. It is therefore imperative to establish a Supranational Communications Center, SCC, under which 5 or more regional communications research centers would initially operate at strategic positions around the world to cover Europe, Asia, North and South America, Africa, and the Middle East. Operationally, the center acts as the nerve center for supranational and supercultural research and studies, as a data center for communication scholars, students, concerned persons, and also a promotion center for furthering supranational cooperation, otherwise known as conquest. Admittedly, there are enormous difficulties and Herculean tasks ahead. However, the time is right, the atmosphere is right for such a global endeavor. And remember, this paper is from 1973. Now up here in the top right corner, you find your classification markings, SCC, HSIA, or SIA. I guarantee those classification markings will be found on other heinous documentation, which may or may not be even under tighter control than this document itself. Much more than simply crossing international boundaries, international communications transcend language barriers, obviate academic disciplines, encompass every field of science and humanity, involve every society and nation, accelerate modernization, and help bring about a world culture which is almost a reality now. In view of the detente between West and East and the shifting trend from military confrontation to economic competition to economic cooperation, international communications seem to be the most important of all international endeavors in the promotion of international understanding and cooperation. However, international communication is like the weather. Everyone talks about it, but no one does anything about it, and that is no one except the members of ICA and AEJ, whoever those are. The state of communications research today seems to be full of vitality and also of controversies, partly due to the divergent orientations and interests of the research organizations and the researchers, and partly due to a lack of coordination among scholars of different disciplines in media and attitudinal research. For example, controversial findings can never be exhausted as new controversies appear. Synthesization, or the synthesization, that's strangely hard to say right now, of all possible theories into a compact whole raises grave doubts in the minds of behaviorists, political scientists, sociologists, and communication students. As sciences thrive on controversies and diversities, however, that does not preclude the desirability of formulating a general communications theory universally applicable to all cultures so as to coordinate various efforts of various disciplines. Communications, broadly defined, is the transference not only of information but also knowledge, error, opinions, thoughts, ideas, experiences, wishes, orders, emotions, feelings, and moods. Notice the use of the word there, orders. And the expression of feelings, wishes, commands, desires, or whatever it may be, and it covers all deliberate uses of language, signs, symbols, and signals by human beings, as well as voluntary or involuntary exclamations, movements, gestures, sighing, crying, laughing, dancing, insofar as they are informative. To further exemplify the problem, the definition of communications media has a great deal of disparity. Doob, whatever, some name, distinguishes two very broad categories of media, basic and extending media. The classification is dependent upon the presence or absence of the communicator. Weeb restricts the term media to communications which are readily available to most of the public. Clapper, in addition to mass communications media, includes personal transmission media. Generally following the definition of Weeb and Clapper, Hovland surveys the whole field of the effects of mass media, expanding the model of who says what, in which channel, to whom, with what effect. Laswell takes a functional approach to identify 4 factors that determine communications effects: the communicator, the communication, the medium, and the audience. The functions of the media, Hovland states, are attracting an audience, conveying information, changing opinion and attitude, and inducing action. Based on these functions, Hovland argues the difference in media effects can be tested. Conflicting evidence, like the German mark after World War I, has been proliferating and, as a consequence, devaluating. Therefore, a general systems theory is called for, not necessarily as a panacea, but as a working system for the systemization of findings and theories. Every modern society is today a patriarchal society, but any similarity ends at the appellation. That line right there is replicated across every major institution that exists on this planet. And we will find out soon why. Women are more persuasible than men, as women are more culturally conditioned. When interaction between the communicator's sex, environment, and subject sex was brought into light, Ciotat found significantly different interaction. Exline substantiated the findings of Anastasi that women may be more person-oriented or people-oriented, therefore are more easily persuaded. Marston and Levine found them more interaction-oriented. Wittenborn confirmed the difference in sex roles. Hovland and Janis, the communication and cultural interaction in which differential patterns of behavior emerge. Behavioral patterns are, of course, one of the major topics of cross-culture studies. This sounds like a conversation that two entities who despise and look at human beings as insignificant in, say, the Star Trek series or Star Wars or any of the other science fiction novels. That is what this sounds like. A arrogant and diminutive study of human beings. It may be appropriate to assume that all audience, communicator, personality effects, and media research in one way or another measures the effects of communications as its primary objective. In addition to the difference of media, channel, and communicator, communications effects are also to a large extent determined by the personality and predispositions of an individual, and to no less an extent by the media and source of communication. But how far these research findings can be generalized across cultures is a question of fundamental importance. With due respect to pioneer workers in the field, more extensive studies not only about the change of the traditional society as a result of mass communications, but concerning all ramifications of influence and effects precipitated by international information flows should be attempted. Clearly, international communications research should progress at a cooperative research effort. Efforts should not be directed at communication effects exclusively. Related areas such as sociology, psychology, economics, political science, philosophy, cybernetics, anthropology, physiology, and many other relevant disciplines ought to be allowed to contribute to international communications research. The general area of international communications research are well compiled, for example, in a Michigan State University study entitled A Preliminary Bibliography of Communication and the Development of Nations. With regional censors possessing a collection of demographic data and other vital statistics, and research facilities in both the United States and abroad, it is possible to carry out on a large scale and in a continuous basis all processes of modernization, development, and communications can be closely recorded, tested, and compared, if not controlled, may thus be known. Mass media in all lands must be encouraged to orient itself towards world order and a world culture. Concerned citizens and institutes of the world must be approached for cooperation and dissemination of the facts and figures without prejudice, and mass communication professionals must be encouraged to report, publish, and broadcast more and more objectively about foreign nations and other peoples. Since no systematic study has yet been undertaken, the lack of a concerned attack upon problems of international communications make it appear that we have been conducting a guerrilla warfare, resorting to ambush and skirmish to achieve a technical victory as the opportunity presents itself. More latent, however, is mass communication as an instrument to effectively shape and change the aspirations of the people, to establish their national identity and pride, and to improve the economic lot of the society. Solutions to these problems lie in the organization of a talent pool to be provided with necessary finances and facilities to engage in a well-thought-out plan systematically attacking the problems. Development activities. Priori development organization. Development activities essentially encompass both research and dissemination activities. Basically, there are three difficulties not listed in the order of importance. First, difficulties in financing the SCC and regional centers on a permanent basis with incremental budgeting support in proportion to the growth of centers. Third, difficulties in determining the research and development priority for these three difficulties. Four separate but coordinating committees are to be established: the Planning Committee, the Finance and Resources Committee, the Research Committee, and the Evaluation Board. Formation of the Planning Committee Board of Directors. The committee consists of 9 members nominated and selected among scholars from international communication, political science, economics, sociology, and other disciplines. They are entrusted with the responsibility of overall planning for and coordination of the SCC worldwide research, development, and dissemination activities. The nomination procedure may be undertaken by one of the internationally known organizations such as the ICA. Change those letters and you get CIA. Pretty obviously. Under priority development, we've got study of center locations, 1 to 2 years, establishment of the evaluation board, 1 to 2 years, and selection of key personnel in 1 year. Collection of basic communication data, 5 years, and data retrieval system updating system, 5 years. Under the regional development, we've got SCC Asia, 2 years, Latin America, 3 years, Africa, 4 years, Middle East, 5 years, and Europe, 5 years. And of course, remember, this is a paper published from 1973. There has been a lot of evidence to show that not only has this been implicated, but it is in fact operational today across every section, corner of the globe, if you will. Developmental activities, establishment of international libraries, this is 1 to 5 years. Establishment of data archives, 5 years. Information clearinghouse and referral service, 5 years. Microfilming and recording service, 5 years. Establish supranational communication survey labs, 3, 4, and 5 years. Establish supranational experimental communication labs, 4 and 5 years. The committee may work on the principle that the SCC shall never be dominated by any one nation or group of nations politically allied, nor by any academic discipline, so as to make its composition of members as inclusive, all-inclusive as possible. Members of the development committee shall be selected from persons with reputed organizational skills from different nations and different disciplines. They shall be nominated and elected by the members of the planning committee. Their primary tasks, in addition to the organization of the SCC World Center, include 1. Studies in the location of the SCC World Center and the number, size, location, functions of its regional centers. 2. Studies in the establishment of international communication libraries to be located at communicatively strategic centers in the world. Systematic compilation of communication-related publications, establishment of communication data archives, studies and implementation on communication data retrieval systems and updating systems, studies on the microfilming and recording service accessible and available to all bona fide nations, organizations, and individuals. Bona fide, by the way, is Italian for good faith. Studies on the information clearing and referral services, feasibility of studies in the exchange of international communication scholars and students, feasibility studies on setting up international symposiums, conferences, meetings, and lectures, and 10, studies on the SCC dissemination activities and coordination of regional dissemination activities. Of course, in the context of this document, studies is simply a word that's interchangeable with activities. It is simply a cover word, like many of these are. Members of the committee select their own chairman, who is also a member of the planning committee, the board of directors later. We're going to see that repeated throughout all of these various committees. Particular attention must be paid to finances and resources to secure continuous support essential for the survival and development of the SEC. The Planning Committee is entrusted again with the responsibility of inviting expert fundraisers to join the Resources and Finance Committee. Its chairman is a member of the Planning Committee, the Board of Directors later. So that's twice we've been repeated that. It is obvious that this chairman being selected from a planning committee is very important, the Board of Directors. The Research Committee consists of, or the provision of the Research Committee. The Research Committee consists of members chosen from among internationally renowned scholars in various fields related to mass communications, human communications, and international communications by the Planning Committee, and later the Governing Board of Directors. Within the Research Committee, there may be subcommittees in the following areas: Subcommittee for Theoretical and Basic Research, including Systems Research; Subcommittee for Applied Research, including Promotion of Mass Communication between Rival Blocks of Nations; and Studies on Modernization Processes by Communication; Subcommittee for International Cooperative Research; Subcommittee for Regional Research; and others that may be composed at a later stage. All these subcommittees' functions and activities must be coordinated with the Development Board. The Research Committee is also charged with the responsibility of establishing an International Survey Research Laboratory, an International Experimental Laboratory, with the cooperation of Development Committee. In addition to providing guidance and assistance for the establishment of the SEC regional centers, the committee is also to direct and coordinate research efforts by regional SEC centers throughout the world. The chairman of the committee, an ex officio member of the board of directors, is to be elected by its committee members. In addition, the SEC Central will join with the board on a constant and continuous basis to evaluate various operations, activities, and facilities of all centers. Facilities and service development, establishment of international communications libraries, relevant books and other publications, not only on communications, but also on the history, politics, economics, sociology, and religions of each society and country, should be collected and indexed to facilitate international communications. Research. The first library is to be set up at the SEC in the United States, SEC USA. The second in Asia, and so on. Such systematic compilation has in mind the eventual establishment of an international data archives in various parts of the world. Another important task for the proposed SEC libraries is to microfilm major publications and record major news broadcasts by radio and television for future reference and research. This task can be delayed but should postponed no longer than the third year of the SEC's operation. Microfilm and recordings will be furnished to any bona fide research institute at cost upon request. The selection of microfilm and recordings will have to be worked out at a later date. All relevant data, such as any socioeconomic political data, will be entrusted to the libraries for classification and safekeeping. The exchange of scholars and students program is not necessarily confined to communications scholars and students, but may also include students in all related areas of communication, such as anthropology, biology, electronics, physiology, psychology, cybernetics, economics, sociology, and political science. Miller and Barwin suggested HIRC, Human Communication International Consortium, with the objectives of increasing the accessibility of international research information and data, and creating a clearinghouse for their dissemination. Again, these are cover terms. They are, in fact, a conventional, active enemy military intelligence and planning component, with the full capabilities of such an entity. By going one step further, the SECs may establish a referral service in addition to the information clearinghouse, on the consideration that it is an almost impossible task to collect and store all information a researcher may need. A symposium can be tentatively scheduled for each region every year. The symposium may be co-sponsored by the centers with an educational institute in the region. The topics of symposiums and conferences are to be mainly concerned with the development and modernization processes of any region. Particular attention must be paid to the relation between modernization processes and international communications. Data collection is to be the major activity prior to the establishment of a data archive and is to be closely coordinated with other research activities. Basic data collection is the primary operation of any successful research project, and of course any military intelligence outfit, particularly in an international setting, and must be maintained on a permanent basis. The SEC Central may have its headquarters in the United States, where research facilities are more readily available. so that a proto-model for the establishment of SCC centers elsewhere can be built. However, it does not preclude consideration for other possible center locations. That's a piece to really note, especially if you're going after these individuals and their organization. For the sake of eliciting meaningful discussion, the following locations for regional centers are proposed. SCC Asia may be set in either Tokyo or Hong Kong. I would argue Hong Kong nowadays. Both may begin operation in year 2, SCC Latin America in either Mexico City, Mexico, or Quito, Ecuador, possibly both. In year 3, SCC Africa in Lagos, Nigeria. In year 4, SCC Middle East in Beirut, Lebanon. And SCC Europe in Paris or London, both in year 5. And of course, remember the recent explosion in specifically Beirut. These locations may have been chosen not only for the geopolitical importance, but also taking into consideration the availability of trained personnel, existing research facilities, possible cooperation with regional higher educational institutes, and most important of all, their political stability. Leading the best for last, most important of all, their political stability. That basically means the likelihood that the people in the region will destroy these intelligence apparatuses. The crucial matter at present is to determine precisely a set of criteria in the evaluation of a communication system in relation to social, political, and economic development, the employment of the best and most efficient way of exploiting the communications revolution, constructive use of communications in helping advance developing societies. Briefly stated, communications research should be concentrated mainly on 3 areas: quantity, meaning, and direction. Microscopic communications research refers to the studies on information processes of modalities and the central nervous system that require the insight, knowledge of biology, anthropology, neurology, psychology, and physiology. Macroscopic research refers to mass communication studies that incorporate psychology, sociology, political science, economics, history, and philosophy. As contrasted to the present research on immediate effect of media, the real effort of supranational communications should be directed toward a long-term evaluation of the control of communication. The theoretical research activities and also other research and therefore information behavioral oriented of a cooperative research nature, but with particular emphasis on research on the development effects and influence of international communications such as stereotype formation, attitude change, social development, and modernization, seeking a way to understand the phenomena of international communications in order to search for, not a panacea, but the most efficient road leading to promoting international understanding and to realize the maximum facilitation of modernization and development processes in developing and emerging nations and societies. Now, most would look at the word emerging as an adjective, but I would say it's an action verb. They are, in fact, emerging or giving birth to. They are making to come into existence. Experimental work, in addition to survey, interviews, and observation methods, may offer the hope of shedding some true light upon a number of problems that seem insoluble at the moment, simply because of the lack of continuous data obtained under rigid control. Kinetic processes. Human information flows from and to all directions by means of newspaper, magazines, radio, TV, and personal communications in what is called dissemination and diffusion. Communications, thus, from a technical point of view, obey the kinetic laws determined by force, distance, and resistance. The manipulation of kinetics is conceptually simple. Its force can be increased by using electronic or modern techniques, in the case of electronic media, utilizing mass production to increase circulation. In the case of printed media, and the reduction of resistance can be realized by providing receiver sets of raising the education level of the people to remove the resistance of illiteracy. Both strategies can also be used employing redundant and multiple channels, using all available media to supplement and complement one another so as to ensure the presentation of the medium with the least resistance to information processing for a given individual. Now, there's 2 words for what they're talking about here. One is propaganda, and the second is communications jamming. Resistance can be removed by using multiple channels or a particular channel that is suitable for the target audience, for instance, radio in India and Thailand and others. So redundancy in every language and communicative system serves to ease the processing and to cope with equivocation and noise. Ideally, the amount of information that can be transmitted and received should be increased to the relative maximum, like turning up the dial on your radio to drown out any ambient noise. Whereas redundancy, cost, noise, and equivocation should be kept at the relative minimum so as to achieve optimal efficiency. In addition to assisting economic and social development, mass media have the primary functions of 3, innovation, introducing and popularizing new techniques of agriculture, industry, health, and sanitation. And 4, introduction, functioning in many ways as a catalyst in introducing new standards of living, thinking, and behavior. Obviously, the primary functions of communication are not necessarily limited to diffusion and dissemination of information, nor are they restricted to serving as a link between the world outside and the local society, or between the elite and illiterate. So now you understand the way they're using the word illiterate. You're either elite or you're illiterate. The peasant or the semi-illiterate, or between the government and the governed, as is the case traditionally. That tells you the perspective, along with the previous sentence about all societies being patriarchal and all that nonsense. That is the arrogant, contemptuous, treasonous, and tyrannical perspective of the ones imposing this and running at the academic intelligence planning apparatus of a global enemy. This is not simply an enemy of the United States or any one single nation, but rather the cooperative enemy of humanity. The discontent and disillusionment brought about by mass communications diffusion and reflected by social injustice in each traditional and transitional society probably sows the seeds of social turmoil. In what Lerner called the revolution of frustration, mass communications media, despite some evidence to the contrary, have the amazing capacity to bring about the determination for change, for better or for worse, and to prod the people into taking action to initiate the change they have been simulated or stimulated to desire. This is the fermentation process. That's called social engineering in most cases. In every social upheaval, adjustment, revolution, and war, fermentation by mass communication or personal communication on a large scale preceded action. It must be noted that mass communication is not the cause but the tool of social revolution or evolution or international conflict and war. Admittedly, communications in any society, traditional or modern, has never been either entirely good or entirely welcome. For example, communications have disrupted the continuity of traditional society and shattered the patterns of traditional social life and gradually eroded the existing authority of the family, clan, and the privileged classes. Of course, they are now the privileged classes, even though they believe themselves above that type of moniker. Communications also provides for many an escape outlet, promotes over-commercialization, and has been known to create mass hysteria in many communicationally advanced nations and societies. Man's information seeking is principally motivated by a constant desire for survival or pleasure as manifested by any organism or individual. Man adapts and adjusts to the environment for a better, easier life, or seeking an anti-entropic end, as Wiener interpreted it. 3 general trends stand out. First, in all traditional societies, once mass communications media have taken root, they simply mushroom, increasing and expanding at faster rates. Second, once mass communicator media development gains momentum, it quickly reaches the saturation point, where people would have the choice not only of media, but also of contents. And third, increasing communication reduces tensions, as the recent U.S.-China relations amply demonstrated. As a result, this brings about a situation enormously complex for researchers to accurately determine and evaluate communication processes and effects. In the fermentation processes, there emerges a potential force pushing forward for changes in family, clan, social, economic, and political systems. The resultant manifestation of the fermentation process is modernization, thus fermentation is precedent to modernization. Now, what they mean by modernization is very simple. Obedience is not given to any of these institutions, but rather to them, and those who are giving the obedience are unwitting of the fact that they have been essentially forced into such a requirement, similar to the Borg in Star Trek. Resistance is futile, essentially. The necessary components for modernization may be classified as 1. Self-sustaining economy, 2. A stable polity, social mobility, and 4. Range of selection for personal advancement. In a sense, modernization in terms of mass communications development can be viewed in the S-R or action-reaction paradigm. Exposure to modern ideas and knowledge with incubating through the fermentation process cause the people to take overt or covert action, or both, to enforce the expected change in the desired way. Action for our purposes is essentially an evaluation problem of the kinetic and fermentation processes. If so, reaction is the modernization process. Both kinetics and modernization are conspicuous, whereas fermentation is not. A parallel situation with the S-R studies of which one may only speculate what happens inside the black box. However, by thoroughly examining the kinetic and modernization processes, the fermentation processes may thus be known. If the fermentation process is known, modernization can be engineered. Modernization is manifested in urbanization, literacy, mobility, voting, and media participation, empathy, political socialization, achievement norms, well-developed occupational system, and egalitarian class systems. Now notice the word there, well-developed occupational system. Now that does not directly preclude the two uses of the word occupation, being occupying the land and having an occupation similar to a job. Both of those, in fact, are intrinsically tied together, where the occupation of the land by enemy forces and enemy elements is determined by individuals' occupations to carry out such a purpose. It seems, however, the inclination for assimilation is decidedly a major factor in modernization, as in the case of Japan, has shown, and more recently China. All these seem to be manipulatable. Now here's the big one, considering the year 2020. Immunization processes. To reduce or render ineffective any communication dysfunction, it must be treated as a contagious disease. Immunization and communication must be regarded as an integral part of communication, as it is in the health sciences. Apart from the inoculation effect, the immunization process in communications is a manipulated process with predetermined and against communication dysfunctions and propaganda. Generally, it aims at the reduction, prevention, and even elimination of the effects of adverse communications, propaganda, and psychological warfare. To help promote international understanding and cooperation in tasks such as environmental protection on a global scale, it is therefore absolutely essential to systematically study immunization in international communication. The study purpose is aimed at a world less susceptible to propaganda or manipulated campaigns, resulting in a better informed world citizenry, because they want a monopoly on such activities and they want to remove any independent or contrary actors to their control efforts. Admittedly, truth to one person might be propaganda to another. The difficulty in distinguishing between propaganda and truth should be taken into consideration. The strategy in pursuit of international immunization must be begun with a multi-frontal attack. Structural and component analysis, theoretical exploration, method analysis, and communication dysfunction analysis. In component and structure analysis, the philosophies, religions, norms, values, beliefs, taboos, and communication restrictions must be critically examined, even more than the diagnosis and prognosis of a patient in medical science. Such studies can be carried out on a gradual, continuous basis, taking one society at a time and categorizing them later by region, religion, language, and ethics. Immunization method and technique analysis is comparatively simple, as it involves problems of classification rather than conceptualization, classifying methods and techniques from existing literature. Only at a later stage may new immunization methods and techniques be attempted at international cross-cultural settings to ascertain the immunization effectiveness, duration, and attrition against communication dysfunctions or propaganda. So censorship. Various immunization techniques, methods, and forces, which are as a rule derived from laboratory experiments, need to be refined so as to be used at a mass and international level. Bombarded with all sorts of information, man has developed defensive mechanisms that allow him to select information essential to his survival. The defensive mechanisms tend also to block information that may be unpleasant, contrary to his basic beliefs, or fear-arousing, among others. Mass communications media have tended to become increasingly instruments for entertainment, amusement, cultural enlightenment, and easy escape route along with some incidental learning. Indulging in the vicarious experiences provided by mass media, man may reorient himself toward not survival but the fulfillment of his hedonistic inclinations instead. Then communication is simply a source of entertainment or means of escape. This is not simply a contemptuous view towards humanity, but rather as insignificant life forms. It can be assumed that individual inertia and public apathy may be removed by providing information in which the fermentation and motivation processes are permitted to work. Selection processes aiming at selective target audience with selective information may also serve as a supplementary force in fermentation. Notice these words: attack, target, force. Selective exposure and selective interpretation in audience behavior have been known for a long time. Such selectivity on the part of the target audience can be easily harnessed to work for international understanding. By optimum level, it's meant the complementary and supplementary functions of various media and information with the least amount of waste. In conducting international field research, it must be noted that the sentiments, taboos, and culture of the society under examination must be strictly observed. In the works of Dube, Scrum, and Pye, a number of incidents sufficiently demonstrate the necessity of observing the philosophy, religion, values, and conceptual differences of the people whose communications behavior is being studied. Therefore, it is advisable to thoroughly study the area before any field research is to be launched. Yeah. Field research. The SEC should make it known that it is not politically affiliated nor philosophically or ideologically allied with any doctrine, race, creed, caste, or religion to alleviate or eliminate any suspicion. Their allegiances lie elsewhere, essentially. There is no way to readily translate such terms as canonical analysis. Interesting, they start with the word canonical, or analysis of variance into non-Indo-European languages. Another problem is obvious: the governmental control of universities in many areas of the world, in which case approaching a university directly is hardly productive. The solution of this problem must wait its turn until the SEC has established its credibility, and the United Nations ought to be asked to contribute its efforts. That's called an intervention force, or essentially invasion. Observation and interview are particularly suitable for the illiterate and the functional illiterate in developing societies. There is no other way of getting the necessary information from peasants who can neither read nor write. In other words, the recipients of a communication are studied on a behavioral continuum, not only how they process information, but how they react to the new information, what kind of change, permanent or temporary, is produced in attitude, how they utilize the new information, and what its dysfunction is. Again, the overriding emphasis is on the modernization process, i.e. to seek out the most efficient way of speeding up modernization in various societies. Any standard international communication laboratory will be the nemesis of international communication research, as it may very well cause stagnation of research, stifle creative thinking, and produce standardized mediocre findings. However, with the objective of encouraging international experimental research, a systematic experimental laboratory which should be attempted is briefly described. It will be treated in full in another paper. Experimental research must be in some way coordinated with field research in order that each may substantiate, verify, or contradict the findings of the other. In studies of attitude change and motivation, manifestation, and behavioral patterns, experimental research may determine the process and magnitude of changes, and the field method may determine this change in terms of meaning and direction. On the other hand, in any experimental situation which may employ both methodologies, information can be transmitted through different mass communications media to be processed by different modalities, and the content can also be vigorously controlled and manipulated in an attempt to ascertain the processes of change and related effects. Experimental methods may yield more controlled results without the contaminating factors implicit in field survey and observational methods. The foremost concern in international experimental research is to ascertain the long-range media effects, particularly television effects, upon modernization processes in societal and individual behavior patterns. Combining both survey research and experimental research, the gradual behavior changes as influenced by media can thus be known and recorded. The imperative of such studies can be seen from the lack of data to compare the TV generation and the generation before it. The social psychology of communications can be illustrated by studies of group structure and behavior, exemplified by the Glanzer and Glasser studies, which essentially are experimental studies in a social setting. The integration of experimental and field studies may further the notion of microscopic and macroscopic studies. The importance of the wedding of microscopic and macroscopic studies can be singularly manifested. Communication studies imperatively must study not only the interaction of men, groups, and societies, but also the various source of interactions. This calls for microscopic studies on physiological and neurophysiological levels. Hence, a sound approach to communications research is the integration of experimental and field studies and that of microscopic and macroscopic studies. In many locations throughout the world, experimental communications research is for, that word I cannot read, feasible, I believe. For example, in Hong Kong, Lebanon, Singapore, Laos, etc. At a later stage, it should be implementable elsewhere. The purpose of such an elaborate network of survey and experiment labs is to facilitate research efforts throughout the world. Yeah, research efforts. Sure. To realize the imperative of such a task, one needs only contemplate the ease of carrying out supranational communication on social studies when such a network is completed. Directives for any survey or experiment need only be seen out to various cooperative centers around the world and survey and experiment returns completed. The directives would specify characteristics of subjects, experimental or survey procedure and administration, testing environment, appliances, instruments, size of sample, data formation, questionnaire or test, etc. The seemingly chaotic state of mass communications research is partly due to the different nomenclature used in communication research, which borrows heavily from every branch of science. In addition, controversial findings in communications research result in large part from diversified research conditions and different interpretations. One of the major tasks to be undertaken is to strive for uniformity in communications terminology and nomenclature. Well, I guess they don't care so much about diversity and inclusion in that context. Proposed centers should have their own editorial staff and primitive duplicating and reprinting facilities, and there should probably be a contracted printing shop for the SCC monthly and SCC monographs. Next, we are going to talk about Table 3, ERIC Discrete Implementation Strategy Compilation, in parentheses, n equals 73. Now, as referenced in the previous document, most people take either covert or overt actions. Another way to say that is either something is done openly, obviously, and out in front of others, or it is done in a capacity that's hidden or cloaked somehow. Take the example of a chessboard. Each move that you make on a chessboard is open and seen and present. However, there are various moves in the game of chess that you make in anticipation of making future moves. And that is the purpose towards operating under some type of cloak or cover, shield, or diversion. In this context, you see the academia structure as a planning and intelligence apparatus for an inimical and adversarial organization desiring to conquer and control humanity. So, today, many of their activities are becoming far and more overt, more out in the open, more seen. Whereas in the past, they would have been a lot more careful and constructed more facades. They still operate under many covers and many false identities, many diversions, many cloaks, many distractions, whatever you want to call it. And that's what this is. A refined compilation of implementation strategies results from the expert recommendations for implementing change, ERIC project. Implementation Science 2015, 1021. So obviously this is much later than the previous document that we read, which coincidentally came from something called the ERIC database. So one has to wonder how long this quote-unquote ERIC project has been going on, and the fact that there are many different acronym designations, different designations for that acronym, ERIC. Some things to highlight here: alter patient/consumer fees. Create fee structures where patients/consumers pay less for preferred treatments, the clinical innovation, and more for less preferred treatments. Assess for readiness and identify barriers and facilitators. Assess various aspects of an organization to determine its degree of readiness to implement, barriers that may impede implementation, and strengths that can be used in the implementation effort. Capture local knowledge. Now, capture and share local knowledge. Emphasis on the word capture. Capture local knowledge from implementation sites on how implementers and clinicians made something work in their setting and then shared it with other sites. Centralized technical assistance. Develop and use a centralized system to deliver technical assistance focused on implementation issues. Change accreditation or membership requirements. Strive to alter accreditation standards so that they require or encourage use of the clinical innovation. Work to alter membership organization requirements so that those who want to affiliate with the organization are encouraged or required to use the clinical innovation. Now here's the big one. Change liability laws. Participate in liability reform efforts that make clinicians more willing to deliver the clinical innovation. Sounds like they're talking about COVID death shots here. Change record systems. I think we all know what that means. Change record systems to allow better assessment of implementation or clinical outcomes. Conduct clinical small tests of change. Implement changes in a clinical fashion using small tests of change before taking changes system-wide. Tests of change benefit from systematic measurements, and result of the tests of change are studied for insights on how to better. This process continues serially over time, and refinement is added with each cycle. Conduct educational outreach visits. Have a trained person meet with providers in their practice settings to educate providers about the clinical innovation with the intent of changing the provider's practice. So that means bad faith. That's what that word for that is. It's bad faith. It's going under false pretense with an ulterior motive. Create new clinical teams. Change who serves on the clinical team, adding different disciplines and different skills to make it more likely that the clinical innovation is delivered or is more successfully delivered. Create or change credentialing and or licensure standards. Create an organization that certifies clinicians in the innovation or encourage an existing organization to do so. Change governmental professional certification or licensure requirements to include delivering the innovation. Work to alter continuing education requirements to shape professional practice toward the innovation. Develop and implement tools for quality monitoring. Develop, test, and introduce into quality monitoring systems the right input, the appropriate language, protocols, algorithms, standards, and measures of processes, patient/consumer outcomes, and implementation outcomes that are often specific to the innovation being implemented. Develop disincentives. Just like it sounds, provide financial disincentives for failure to implement or use the clinical innovation. Those are usually called fines in some cases, but there's other uses for that word, disincentivize. Facilitate relay of clinical data to providers. I think we know what that means as well. Provide as close to real-time data as possible about key measures of processes/outcomes Using integrated modes, channels of communication in a way that promotes use of the targeted innovation. Fund a contract for the clinical innovation. Governments and other payers of service issue requests for proposals to deliver the innovation, use contracting processes to motivate providers to deliver clinical innovation, and develop new funding formulas that make it more likely that providers will deliver the innovation. Identify and prepare champions. Identify and prepare individuals who dedicate themselves to supporting, marketing, and driving through an implementation, overcoming indifference or resistance that the intervention may provoke in an organization. Increase demand. Attempt to influence the market for the clinical innovation to increase competition intensity and to increase the maturity of the market for the clinical innovation. Involve executive boards. Involve existing governing structures, boards of directors, medical staff, boards of governance in the implementation effort, including the review of data on implementation processes. Make billing easier. Make it easier to bill the clinical innovation. To bill for the clinical innovation. Mandate change. Have leadership declare the priority of the innovation and their determination to have it implemented. Place innovation on fee-for-service lists/formularies. Work to place the clinical innovation on lists of actions for which providers can be reimbursed. It's called kickbacks or quid pro quo. Drug is placed on a formulary, a procedure is now reimbursable. Promote network weaving. That's an interesting one. Identify and build on existing high-quality working relationships and networks within and outside the organization, units, teams, etc., to promote information sharing, collaborative problem solving, and a shared vision /goal related to implementing the innovation. Think we know what that means. Provide local technical assistance. Develop and use a system to deliver technical assistance focused on implementation issues using local personnel. Recruit, designate, and train for leadership. Recruit, designate, and train leaders for the change effort. Revise professional roles, a shift in revised roles among professionals who provide care and redesign job characteristics. Start a dissemination organization. Identify or start a separate organization that is responsible for disseminating the clinical innovation. It could be a nonprofit or for-profit organization. Use an implementation advisor. Seek guidance from experts in implementation. Use data warehousing techniques. Integrate clinical records across facilities and organizations to facilitate implementation across systems. I'm starting to think that this implementation is a key word here. Use mass media, referencing the document we recently looked at. Use media to reach large numbers of people to spread the word about the clinical innovation. Yeah, I think we know what they're talking about there. Use other payment schemes. Introduce payment approaches in a catch-all category. Now, this next document can be seen as an example of the implementation of both those previous documents. The Michigan Journal of Community Service Learning, spring 2009. Yes, this predates the last one that we actually read. Service learning from a distance, partnering multiple universities and local governments in a large-scale initiative. With this growing acceptance of service learning, another code word, cover word for what they're really doing, it is now appropriate to examine complex projects to identify models capable of taking higher education service learning to the next level. International components, cross-disciplinary teams, multiplicity of participants and sites, and remote locations that rely on virtual communication are examples of such complexities. Encompassing the last three components, the paper describes a 3-year statewide service learning project coordinated by 3 state government agencies, including more than 275 college students, supervised by 6 professors at 5 universities, and provided a service to nearly 100 local units of government. Representatives of instructors, state agency coordinators, and students co-authored this case study presented in the context of the project's origin, iterative processes and outcomes assessment, and analyzed in terms of reflective methods, problems, resolutions, and recommendations. To address the above issues and questions, the Office of Technology Partnership, OTP, and the Michigan Department of Information Technology collaborated with the Michigan Townships Association, MTA, and the Michigan Municipal League, MML. They spearheaded an ambitious initiative to put local governments online using academic service learning projects, channeled through the Information Systems IS programs at Michigan universities. The goals were the development of operational and sustainable websites, achievement of student academic requirements, growth in student interpersonal and communication skills, and increasing student awareness of civic engagement and citizenship that might bear fruition in subsequent years. The project had 3 basic phases: pilot, extension, and assessment. An overview of the participant relationships is provided in Figure 1. In this paper, MTA and MML, led by OTP, are collectively referred to as the state agents. Local government units, townships, and villages are the community partners. Student developers and student assessors are 2 distinct sets of student participants. The initiative as a whole is called the Local Government Website Initiative. From the list of volunteer local governments, professors selected local government partners. At the same time, a preparation checklist was developed and sent to local governments so they would be ready to respond to student teams, thereby expediting the process. Remote service learning occurred from almost all teams at all participating universities because their assigned townships and cities were outside reasonable driving distances. At mid-semester, the state office requested from the university professors an informal status report for each of their respective assigned government units, and attempts were made to resolve problems. The state office handled publicity and prepared certifications of appreciation for all university faculty. Faculty at each university were able to autonomously manage and assess their student projects so long as they remained within the framework for university developers. At Northern Michigan University, the website projects were the basis for a senior project's capstone course in information systems. Using a common introduction letter, teams initiated contact with their assigned government office. An important project goal was to develop websites that were maintainable. Of course, I think we all know by whom. To assure a broader and more objective evaluation, senior business students enrolled in the Management Information Systems course were enlisted rather than IS students. One discipline assessed the work of another. Approximately 20% of class time was devoted to project-related teamwork. There was no direct contact with student developers. Assessment of student learning was not a goal. Based upon the evaluation report, it was decided to continue the program, and local governments would be directed to improve marketing of their new websites. The management and marketing students individually received a letter of appreciation from the governor, thanking them for their role in the overall website initiative. In a study of 38 nonprofit organizations, Bassinger and Bartholomew, 2006, found 2 core motivations for community participation in service learning. Intrinsic motives, e.g. helping students, giving them a better understanding of the mission of the nonprofit, and cultivating citizenship, had higher Likert mean scores than intrinsic motives, e.g. getting free labor, cultivating future volunteers, and improving their image. The recruitment of university partners was not problematic. There were logical issues. The state agent managed 5 universities, each having their own constraints, availability of service learning courses offerings, newly assigned faculty unreceptive to the service learning project, lower than expected student enrollment, or commitments to other service learning partners. Actual community-university pairing was time-consuming and could not be done until just prior to the semester. The recruitment, scheduling, and oversight of university and community partners was the responsibility of the OTB staff member, a third-party resource allocation that does not exist in small-scale projects. Spreadsheet software, a designated state agent contact, and creation of a management plan aided the recruitment and oversight process. Having an intermediary for overall project management seemed to distance some instructors both physically and mentally from a community partners as compared to a local project. That sounds exactly like what they would want here. As pointed out by Bushouse, 2005, service learning projects might be marketed as free labor and a win-win situation, but nothing is really without cost. Communication gaps, unfamiliarity with the community, and a lack of understanding of government operations manifested themselves in a lack of content needed for government websites. Solutions were to match students with projects where any kind of connection existed, vacation or home area of friends or relatives, and reliance on web to learn about geographic locations. Some students needed to be trained in research methods to obtain information on their own. While beneficial class time spent on research methods jeopardized the technology learning goals of the course, in some cases additional technical learning tasks were assigned to specific students to help span the time, as well as fortify skills in other cases. Students were shifted to other groups to create a more even balance of skill sets, responsiveness, and to complete the multiple projects by the given deadline. All students appeared to be more satisfied after receiving the individual letter of appreciation from the governor, thanking them for developing a Michigan local government website. Eiler maintains that when students undergo preparation for service, and that includes reflection on the task before them, they continuously reflected during the service as part of their problem-solving and critical thinking activities. Then post-service reflection is better positioned to strengthen learning. After service, at the conclusion of team projects, each student wrote a narrative answering 3 questions. Overall, what did I do, how did I do it, and why that way? And what did I learn technically and personally? They were encouraged to be honest rather than strive for an expected answer. To a larger audience, each team gave a presentation on their project and lessons learned. Each team prepared training materials and a closure letter, tasks that required them to reflect once more on the partner's needs and what the students had gained from the experience. All universities used some form of culminating reflection paper, presentation, or both. In their post-course results, Wang and Jackson found an increase in student thinking towards social justice. It's not a surprise. Recommendations for a large-scale, multi-partner, multi-site remote service project can be broadly grouped into 2 categories: logistical and effective. Regular communication throughout the network is needed. Communication should be welcome as a value-added process, not dreaded as a bureaucratic burden. Ongoing communication between university partners, in this case faculty members, should be encouraged. To increase community partner commitment to projects, local community goals must align with the goal of the initiative. Conducting a verifiable pre-assessment on potential partners' commitment, readiness, and experience will help in selecting those best suited for the projects. Future research. One topic that surfaced from the study calls for further research, a long-term effect on both student and instructor civic engagement. While some work has been done on future civic engagement by students, existing literature on how service learning affects the instructor's civic propensities is limited. In a comprehensive meta-analysis of service learning research from 1993 to 2000, civic engagement is not mentioned in the 5 categories of impact on faculty, but focuses on the role of the instructor plays in activating student reflection. Green, 2006, offers a more advanced framework for reflective thinking with 2 parallel processes: student reflection and instructor reflection, moving through the same recurrent stages of emotion reaction, personalization, increased understanding, connection to course content, and transformational thinking. However, the premise of Green's model is the improvement of the service learning process. Rather than limiting reflection to effectiveness of service learning in the course and the student learning process, an additional benefit should be explored. Does reflection increase the instructor's civic engagement?